Welcome to the next chapter in the read-through of Achilles, The Making of a Hero. If you want to find your own copy of the book, be sure to check out my link in the description for the video, and also be sure to like and subscribe and check out the channel in this playlist if you want to follow along with the previous prologue or any of the upcoming chapters of the book as well. Today's reading is Chapter 1, 15 Years Later. Patroclus ran through the dark woods at a frantic speed. The nearly full moon hung high in the clear, dark sky and was the only source of light to show him where he was going. His sandals slapped against the uneven terrain, maneuvering around rocks, snapping dead twigs, and rustling dried leaves. Small branches scratched his face as he continued to push himself forward into the unknown darkness. Any small animals that might have wanted to avoid contact with a human that night certainly had plenty of time to get out of the way and hide, because stealth was obviously the last thing on Patroclus's mind. In fact, a small rabbit that had scurried to its burrow upon hearing Patroclus coming would have sworn that it was a wild boar stampeding through the forest. The slim boy's brunette hair flowed behind him as he moved. His hazel eyes were in constant movement, surveying the landscape in front of him to ensure he didn't run into a tree or off a cliff, or trip on any of the numerous rocks and tree roots scattered along the path. One thing was clear amidst this frantic frolic through the woods in the middle of the night: Patroclus was running from something. The crimson red blood that was smeared on Patroclus's hands and toga looked even darker and more ominous in the moonlight, as if he was covered in black tar. It had all been a horrible mistake, an accident. Even now, Patroclus was not completely sure how it happened. Cleisonimus was his best friend. They had grown up together. Patroclus would never purposely hurt anyone, let alone someone he cared about. Cleisonimus was always the one with the plan. He always knew not only what they needed to do to have fun, but more importantly, how to do it successfully without getting caught. Cleisonimus was always scheming, his dark chestnut eyes always on the lookout for mischief, whether it was stealing a pastry from the local baker or sneaking a couple horses out the stables for an afternoon ride. Their friendship was a natural partnership, because Patroclus only needed to hear a plan and he was off to do his part before he had time to think about the consequences. He still carried a couple rod-shaped bruises across his back to prove it, too. Patroclus's father was the leader of a small village, and Cleisonimus was apprenticed to the local blacksmith of the same village. The small setting made it pretty easy to uncover the source of any shenanigans when food went missing, or if a rude word was painted onto the wall of the local temple. Yet the boys never seemed to realize how unsuccessful their mischievous plans usually were. Perhaps they simply didn't care, for the punishments were rarely more than a few stern words or a couple quick swats with a rod. The two boys were inseparable, and no one saw their antics as anything more than the wrestled games of a couple boys whose personalities and ambitions were larger than the small home could completely contain. Most folks expected the boisterous young men to leave the village one day and accomplish great things. But for now, they had to deal with a little steam being released here and there on a fairly regular basis. The boys had talked and dreamed of leaving the small village and heading to one of the larger city-states that littered the countryside. They would join a strong army and become real men, complete with the fame and glory that came with demonstrating heroic deeds on the battlefield. On warm afternoons, when they felt particularly lazy, they would make up tales about the great battles they were sure to be part of, the enemies they would vanquish, the exotic lands they would explore, and the excellent treasure they would hoard. But as with most things in life, it was always just talk, more real in a young boy's mind than anywhere else. Only children can speak of the future with enough enthusiasm to make the listener actually believe it could come true. Well, Patroclus had certainly gotten out of the small village now, hadn't he? Off to see the world as it flashed by him while he ran for his life. No one was chasing him. In fact, no one would discover what had been done until well after sunrise. But there was no way for him to know that at the moment. The only thing running through his mind was the need for his feet to continue moving as fast as they could and continue placing some distance between his now old life and whatever was out there waiting for him in the world. On hot summer days, the boys could be found running through fields of sun-kissed golden wheat, down to the stream for a cool swim, just Patroclus and Clisonymus. Maybe they would find a couple of sticks and sword fight with each other. Clisonymus was able to lure Patroclus into clever traps, letting him work himself into a frenzy, thinking he had an advantage. Then, as Clisonymus continued to parry furious stabs, wild overhead slashes, and wild arcs, he would easily find an opening and send Patroclus to the ground, gasping with one well-placed strike. "Ha! You need to control yourself, idiot," Clisonymus would remark, laughing with a playful glint in his eye. "I get you every time because you just randomly strike without any plan for what is going to come next. You leave so many openings that I could take you out any time I like." Yeah, so you keep telling me, Mr. Pretty Boy. Patroclus had heard it 1,000 times, but he couldn't help it. Every time he started fighting, his mind just went into autopilot mode. He would spend all day thinking about what kind of fighting strategy he was going to try, what kind of defensive stance he needed to follow, which strikes. But once the time came, that careful planning would all go right to the door and leave him to do little more than flail around like a brainless crazy person. But Clisonymus would start laughing, and Patroclus would start laughing as well, and then before you know it, the two of them would simply be friends again, swimming and cooling off in the river. That's how things went. Clisonymus always the leader, always the guy with the plan. Then there was Patroclus, always the guy to act without thinking, always the one getting the blunt end of the stick because he couldn't think more than a step ahead. But as with most things from youth, it could not all last forever. A few hours before Patroclus began running through the darkness, he and Clisonymus had pulled off their greatest and last bit of mischief to date. The local village had a temple to the god Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of the harvest and of wine, so it was appropriate since the village was home to mostly rural farmers who tended to grow grain fields and fruit orchards. It wasn't so much a temple as a small statue of Dionysus set against the rock face just outside the village, covered with a roughly cut stone roof held up by a couple of crumbling columns. Each harvest, the villagers would conclude the season by taking the best grapes of their crops and making a special batch of wine. This wine was to be offered up in sacrifice to Dionysus, hoping he would continue to bless their crops with a fruitful harvest. Well, the night that the sacrificial wine was offered up to the temple, Patroclus and Clisonymus were feeling a little thirsty. As anyone would expect, Clisonysus came up with a plan. After nightfall, the majority of the villagers would head back home, leaving the temple lit by candles. It was at that point the boys made their move. They crept quietly through the darkness, ensuring they didn't make a sound as they moved into the temple, blowing out the candles on either side as they went. Once they were shrouded in darkness, they came face to face with the marble statue of the wine god. He was plump and smiling with a crown of grape leaves on his head and the smallest hint of devious mischief in his eyes. It was that mischievousness that the boys were hoping Dionysus would understand as they got onto either side of the jug, holding the wine, and began to lift. It was a large clay jug, and the wine sloshed back and forth as they made their way out of the temple and into the neighboring woods where they could celebrate the spoils of their exploits. In a quiet glen, the boys sat down to enjoy themselves, pulling out a couple of simple goblets to dip into the jug. "To us, my friend, the greatest wine thieves of a generation," Clisonymus toasted as he raised a goblet of wine to his lips. "Yes, no one has ever shimmied a 50-pound jar out of a temple quite as spectacularly as we have," Patroclus answered, raising his own goblet as beads of wine dripped down his head. The boys drank, laughed, told crude stories, drank some more, and laughed even louder. Soon the boys were wrestling and dancing around their clearing, the wine jug considerably lighter than when they carried it out of the temple. The ground was stained purple from all the wine they had been spilled and poured all over as the boys partied. Soon there was only one cup of wine left. "One left, good friend. What are we to do?" Clisonymus managed to say as he swayed where he stood. "I know. Give me a stick. We will fight for it." "You will not trick me so easily tonight, good friend. I think we all know who the winner would be in our drunken duel. Here, let's leave it up to the gods who gets the last sweet drop. I have a couple dice here, If I roll an even number, it is mine, and if I roll an odd number, it is yours. Fine, coward. If you're too afraid to fight for what you want, let's leave it to chance then. Clisonimus was still smiling, but there was a definite edge to his voice. His insults usually came out in such a joking manner, but this time he almost spat the word coward in Patroclus's face. A little taken aback, Patroclus dropped the dice and let them roll. Looks like the gods favor the coward tonight, Clisonimus said as an 8 appeared between the two die. Enjoy your well-earned spoils. He picked up the cup and tossed it at Patroclus, splashing wine all over him. Hey, what in the name of Hades is wrong with you? Patroclus said as he wiped wine off his face. This was not the first time they had enjoyed some drinks before, yet he had never seen Clisonimus to be an angry junk. There was definitely something wrong. Nothing wrong, old friend. Hey now, that you are done with that wine, how about a little duel? Clisonimus went to a nearby tree and broke off a couple of branches. As he threw a branch at Patroclus, he said, Here, let's see if you've learned anything yet. Patroclus could raise his stick. Before Patroclus could raise his stick, he was whacked in the arm. He dropped the stick with a cry of pain. Cut that out. This is not funny anymore. I'm heading home if this is how you're going to act. As he turned to leave, a sharp pain struck him in the back of his head. Stars burst in front of his eyes as he fell to the ground. Turning over, he looked up at his supposed friend with dazed eyes. What in the... But the words were lost in his throat. Looking up at Clisonimus, he was not seeing the friend he had grown up with. There was an evil, twisted glint in his eyes. Those were not Clisonimus's eyes. This couldn't be his friend. Something extremely wrong was happening. Oh, Patroclus, you are never planning ahead, always leaving yourself open. Let's see if we can't knock some sense into that thick head of yours. With a twisted grin and wide, crazy eyes, Clisonimus raised his stick and rushed at Patroclus. Patroclus had no time to think. As Clisonimus descended onto him, Patroclus withdrew a dagger he had in his belt and brought it up in front of him. Clisonimus fell onto the dagger and let out a gasp, and then went limp. He rolled onto the ground, his dead, shocked eyes gazing up into the dark night sky. What have you done, boy? A man stepped out of the trees and into the clearing. The man's dark curly hair sat on top of his plump, boyish head. He wasn't an obese man, but he certainly had a pot-belly, which pushed against his dark crimson toga. I saw the whole thing. You murdered that poor lad. No, it was a mistake. Patroclus was in shock. He looked at the lifeless body of his friend, unable to accept what was happening. He felt as though he were struck in the middle of a bad nightmare. Mistake? I hardly doubt such a well-placed stab to the heart could simply be a mistake. This is serious, my boy. We need to get the authorities. If you saw the whole thing, then you know that I was defending myself. He had gone insane. He attacked me. All I saw was a couple of boys getting what they deserved for stealing that which was set aside for the gods. A couple of boys that should be thankful. This is all they got. No, we didn't. Wait, how did you know where we got the wine? That was hours ago. Patroclus began to tremble uncontrollably. Why, my boy, it is because that was my wine that you and that limp sack of bones have been guzzling down all night. The man smiled, his plump cheeks pushing his eyes into slits that began to glow a deep, poisonous purple. Besides, Patroclus, didn't you know that my essence is felt at all parties? Because I am the god of parties and celebrations. And Clisonimus and yourself have been partying and celebrating for quite some time now. It was amusing at first, but now my amusement has ended. It is time to pay the tab, as it were. Lord Dionysus! Patroclus still could not move. He felt like he was pinned by a weight to the ground that was getting heavier by the second. My lord, we meant no offense. It was just a stupid prank, a bit of mischief. We would never openly disrespect you. You are the god of partying, so we figured you would understand. Relax, boy. I'm not going to kill you. I've had my share of mischief in my day. Why, I remember one time in Thrace when a little party of mine got pretty out of control. I think the king was overreacting when he called out his army to drive me out of the kingdom. In fact, I could have been in some real trouble if it wasn't for the sweetest little sea nymph who came to my aid when I was driven into the sea." Dionysus looked off into the distance and smiled, as if he was fondly enjoying the memories his tale was invoking. "Anyway, I digress. The reason I'm not going to kill you is because you interest me, Patroclus. There is a lot of talk going on upstairs, and it seems you have a part to play in this world. I must warn you, though, boy, most gods are not as good-natured and as understanding as I am." "Understanding?" Patroclus was finally able to make it back to his feet. "My friend is dead, by my hand, all because we stole some stupid wine? How is that understanding? You are just like all the other gods, cruel, with no care for people or their lives." Tears were streaming down his cheeks as he spoke. He was shaking and did not really know what he was saying, only that he was angry. It was as if he had a veil torn from his eyes. The gods were not beings to be worshipped, but feared and distrusted. "Careful, boy." Dionysus lost his smile, and his eyes brightened as they bore into Patroclus. "My patience and understanding may be long, but not that long. As I said, your time in this world is to continue for a bit longer. So I'm just going to leave you with this thought, then I will depart before you can say anything else stupid. When you feel most safe within a friend's protection is when death will finally come to collect you, as it has come to collect your friend here. Now, ta-ta!" And with that, Dionysus was replaced with a pillar of wine where he had stood. The wine came crashing down, splashing all over the ground, and gushing around Patroclus's feet. He could not even think, not even process what had just happened. At that moment, all he could think of doing was simply to run into the night, and that was going to offer him plenty of time to wrap his head around the preceding events that had just changed his life forever. Patroclus had been running for what seemed like hours, and he still wasn't sure if he understood what had happened. One thing was explicitly apparent to him, though. There was no way he could go back. Who would believe him? And even if he did, Cleisthenes was dead. Patroclus had killed him. How could he face his village after something like that? The first rays of dawn's light began to break over the horizon. Patroclus was exhausted and didn't know how much longer he could go. He came by a small creek and decided to stop for a rest and a desperately needed drink. He dunked his head into the water to cool off and drink from the cold, clean water. The relief was immediate and appreciated. Patroclus rolled to his side and passed out from exhaustion. When Patroclus woke up, the sun was shining on his face. He could have been asleep for a few days or a few hours, he wasn't sure. All he was sure of was that his head was splitting, and the light was piercing his brain through his eyes like 1,000 fiery needles. Actually, that wasn't true. He was aware of something else. A sound. A loud slurping noise. He turned his head to the side and came face to face with a large brown bear drinking from the creek. "Oh!" Patroclus let out a startled shout. The bear, surprised by the noise, lifted its head and looked at Patroclus as if it had not noticed him until now. It opened its mouth and let out a roar, flecking Patroclus's face with slobber. Oh gods, this just wasn't his day. Spared by a god only to be mauled to death by a bear. The bear stood up on its hind legs, stretching up nearly to the heavens as it raised its right paw, ready to bring it crashing down onto Patroclus's comparatively small head. He closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable to happen. A deafening roar erupted from the bear's drool-covered mouth. Patroclus fully expected it to be the last thing he would ever hear. Instead, he heard a heavy, wet thunk, and then a crashing sound, then silence. When Patroclus opened his eyes, the bear was lying next to him, on the ground, facing him. The shaft of an arrow stuck out of the bear's eye, its face frozen mid-roar. Patroclus got up, his knees shaking. He looked down at the bear, his eyes wide and mouth agape. A rustling sound from behind him made him whirl around, on guard from whatever might be coming. A young man came through the trees and came face to face with Patroclus. He was tall, with broad shoulders and long sun-bleached hair that hung loosely. His toga was starkly white against his bronzed olive skin, but what made him more striking was his deep blue eyes. His eyes looked like he was staring right through you, yet there was no malice, no evil in those eyes. Patroclus instantly knew deep down that he could trust this person. "Are you okay, kid?" the young man asked him. The young man's mystique diminished a bit. Kid? Patroclus doubted very much that this guy was any older than he was. Patroclus was 15, and he could have guessed that this guy was definitely not older than him. "I'm surprised you can stand after having come face to face with a big beast like that. Good thing I was out hunting this morning, and that bear might have been slurping some brain jelly right about now. What is your name?" "Mine is Achilles." All right, that's the end of chapter 1 of Achilles, The Making of a Hero. If you want to continue on with the story, be sure to check out my next video, which will read aloud chapter 2. And if you're interested in finding your own copy of the book, be sure to check out the link in my description to the video. Also be sure to like and subscribe if you want to be able to follow and get updates as I add to the read aloud chapters until we get through the entire book. So thanks for listening. Let me know if you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.